The life and artwork of Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold was born in 1930 in New York City. She devoted her life to creating art, being an activist, and changing the art world forever with her skill, ingenuity, and passion. Faith Ringgold is best known for her paintings on fabric or story quilts. Ringgold creates story quilts by sewing together painted canvas and quilted fabric coupled with narrated text. The images in the text tell the story of the artwork. Ringgold spent most of her childhood at home because she suffered from acute asthma. Faith's mother was a seamstress and fashion designer, and while Faith was at home, her mother taught Faith to sew. Faith also spent time in jazz clubs with her parents, being influenced by some amazing performers like Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington. Storytelling and jazz music were major influences on Faith's artwork. Many of her paintings show scenes from jazz clubs or jazz musicians performing. Storytelling is how her parents and other family members would spend their evenings. Faith would listen to her parents and aunts and uncles tell stories of their family history. They also listened to the radio, which would inspire her imagination. Although Faith loved creating art and would often make portraits for family members, she did not study art in high school. She did attend the City College of New York and decided to take art classes there. She had some very critical professors who told her that she could not be an artist because she lacked skill. As a result of those criticisms, Faith made it her mission to become a full-time professional artist. It wouldn't be the first or last time that Faith encountered adversity, but it would be the motivation she needed to show the world how amazing her art could really be. Out of college, Faith became an art teacher in the New York City public schools. She married her high school sweetheart and had 2 daughters. Teaching was very challenging, and unfortunately her marriage did not work out. It was very difficult to be an artist while working as a teacher and raising 2 children on her own. Luckily, she was able to find a more suitable life partner and remarried in 1962. When she had more support raising her children, she had more time and ability to create art. In college, Faith had studied the artwork of the European masters like Van Gogh, Picasso, and Da Vinci. At first, her artwork was influenced by those styles. This type of art seemed to have very little to do with her everyday life and experiences as an African American woman in Harlem. As a result, she started creating artwork that was more meaningful to her. She was fascinated with the patterns and rhythms of African art, and like any great artist, put her own unique spin on these themes. In the 1960s, many people were fighting for equal rights for African Americans. It was common for galleries to reject the artwork of African American people, and Faith was no exception. Faith spent much of her time visiting galleries and museums in person with her artwork, in the hopes that it would be accepted and shown. Faith organized protests in front of museums demanding that the galleries would stop ignoring and rejecting African American artists. Much of Faith's artwork is a commentary upon the horrors of slavery and subsequent prejudice encountered after slavery was abolished in the United States, a topic that galleries did not want to address. By 1973, Faith's artwork started to become more noticed and accepted by big galleries and museums. She was able to make her artwork more accessible as well. On a trip to Europe, Faith had seen an exhibition of Tibetan art featuring tankas. Tankas are large-scale artworks framed in cloth. One of the hardest parts about being an artist is shipping and transporting artworks because it is framed, fragile, and bulky. Creating artwork on cloth allowed it to be rolled up and easily and less expensively shipped. In this way, Faith's artwork could be shipped anywhere in the world with ease. Faith's mother, Willie, a well-known fashion designer in Harlem, used to help her make some of the tonkas or story quilts. Quilt making is an African American art form. Often, quilts made by slaves included designs, shapes, and images from the histories of the people who created them. The story quilt tied so many themes together for Faith. Storytelling done in a manner that was true to her cultural heritage and skills she had gained as a child, addressing themes that were important in shining a light on the absolute need for equal rights. For Faith, the stories she told on the quilts were just as important as the artwork. The frames of the story quilts are especially colorful and filled with lively patterns and designs. In her long career as an artist, Faith wrote several children's books, including the Caldecott Award-winning book Tar Beach, whose main character, Cassie Lightfoot, uses her imagination to soar above the city. Like Faith, Cassie Lightfoot believes that anyone can achieve their dreams if they believe that they can. A lesson which is evident in the determination and passion Faith had in making sure that she would become a successful artist. Today, Faith Ringgold is a world-renowned artist whose work can be seen in museums, galleries, and in public spaces throughout the United States. Faith Ringgold proved that if you really want to achieve your dreams, it is possible. Tar Beach by Faith Ringgold. Now we can already see on the cover the quilt squares that are on the border of the book, which were on the original artwork as well. We can see two children and some adults, and we've also learned and talked about how Faith Ringgold and her parents, a lot of what they did was storytelling and using their imagination, and they would usually hang out on the roof, and they call it Tar Beach because they would have a picnic, and there wasn't any sand, but they still had a really good time, and they would get cool up there. The main character of Tar Beach is Cassie Lightfoot, which we can see up here. We talked a little bit about her in some of the other information about Faith Ringgold, but I don't want to spoil the story too much for you. And again, we continue to see these quilt squares on the borders of each page. I will always remember when the stars fell down around me and lifted me up above the George Washington Bridge. I could see our tiny rooftop with Mommy and Daddy and Mr. and Mrs. Honey, our next-door neighbors, still playing cards as if nothing was going on. And BB, my baby brother, lying real still on the mattress, just like I told him to, his eyes like huge floodlights tracking me through the sky. Sleeping on Tar Beach was magical. Lying on the roof in the night with stars and skyscraper buildings all around me made me feel rich, like I owned all that I could see. The bridge was my most prized possession. Daddy said that the George Washington Bridge is the longest and most beautiful bridge in the world, and that it opened in 1931 on the very day I was born. Daddy worked on that bridge, hoisting cables. Since then, I've wanted that bridge to be mine. Now I have claimed it. All I had to do was fly over it for it to be mine forever. I can wear it like a giant diamond necklace, or just fly above it and marvel at its sparkling beauty. I can fly. Yes, fly. Me, Cassie Louise Lightfoot, only 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, and I can fly. That means I'm free to go wherever I want for the rest of my life. Daddy took me to see the new union building he is working on. He can walk on steel girders high up in the sky and not fall. They call him the cat. But still, he can't join the union because Grandpa wasn't a member. Well, Daddy is going to own that building because I'm going to fly over it and give it to him. Then it won't matter that he's not in their old union or whether he's colored or a half-breed Indian, like they say. He'll be rich and won't have to stand on 24-story high girders and look down. He can look at his building going up. And Mommy won't cry all winter when he goes to look for work and doesn't come home. And Mommy can laugh and sleep late like Mrs. Honey, and we can have ice cream every night for dessert. Next, I'm going to fly over the ice cream factory just to make sure we do. Tonight, we're going up to Tar Beach. Mommy is roasting peanuts and frying chicken, and Daddy will bring home a watermelon. Mr. and Mrs. Honey will bring the beer and their old green card table. And then the stars will fall around me, and I will fly to the Union Building. I'll take BB with me. He's threatened to tell Mommy and Daddy if I leave him behind. I have told him it's very easy. Anyone can fly. All you need is somewhere to go that you can't get to any other way. The next thing you know, you're flying among the stars. Tar Beach by Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold inspired mixed media piece quilts. For this project, you're going to need a 12 by 18 piece of white paper, a paint set, it could be tempera or watercolor, a small cup of water, a paintbrush, probably want a larger paintbrush, 3 paper squares, 3 fabric squares that are about 3 by 3 inches, oil pastels, a pencil, a black marker, crayons and markers, and color pencils, whatever you have, it's your choice, liquid glue, and some heavy books. The books will be to bake your artwork flat and to secure what we're gluing onto your paper. That always, when we layer weight, then we can get a nice flat artwork. So the first thing you need to do is get out your paint set, a brush, and a small cup of water. You're going to paint a border on the large paper with one color and a contrasting color for the center of the paper. A border is like a frame around the edge of your artwork. Often quilt squares, as well as the artwork of Faith Ringgold, have borders with patterns. Since this project is inspired by Faith Ringgold, we're going to be making many borders with patterns. As you can see in Faith Ringgold's artwork, that the edges are all quilt squares. She painted on fabric directly. Her mother was a tailor and taught her to sew at a really young age, so therefore that's why she has these lovely fabric artworks. Now, when you get started painting, you want to make sure that you dip your brush into the water and then gently press it against the paint. You don't want to use too much water for a couple different reasons. One is that your color might come out sort of dull. The other is that if you use too much water, you might rip your paper. A lot of times what artists will do is that they will wait for their artwork to dry and then do a second coat. Also, when you're painting it, it doesn't look as bright as when it is actually dry. So again, you want to not use too much water. You can see that my paper's already starting to get a little bit too wet, and so pretty soon I'm going to be stopping once I fill everything with color. When you're done, you can lay it aside, lay it flat, and hopefully it'll be dry by the time we finish the other parts of this project. Now we're going to be focusing on making the quilt squares. You're going to need 3 fabric squares and 3 paper squares. The paper should be white and the fabric squares can be any design you want. The stiffer the fabric, the better, because you're going to be drawing on them later with the oil pastels. You do want to make sure that they are 3 by 3 because when we arrange them on the paper, we want to make sure that they fit within the beautiful border that you just painted and doesn't go off the page. So we want to keep them smaller as much as we can. Now, before we get started drawing in pencil on the paper squares, we want to think about the idea of peace. This will help us choose the themes for our squares. What does peace mean to you? Think about what peaceful activities you do that make you happy and how you would draw those activities. I feel peaceful when I'm in nature, when I'm gardening, when I'm expressing my love toward my family. So I chose to draw hills with the sun on one square, hearts on another, and a small flower garden on the third. But most importantly, each square needs a border with a pattern, so it looks like a quilt square. A pattern can be any line, shape, or color that is repeated. You can draw a different pattern on each side or the same one. It's really your choice. Now, I start drawing my border without a ruler. If you want a really straight line, I recommend using a ruler, but I don't really strive for perfection in creating my artwork or my projects. I just kind of eye it. But again, a ruler or another piece of paper with a straight edge or a book can make a nice straight line for your border. And you can create a pattern that's as challenging or as simple as you want. I started by making some slanted lines with repeating hearts within it. And I chose a different pattern for the side of my square. So I chose circles with straight lines. But then I used the same pattern on the other side, just because I felt like it. And as I said before, you can do a different pattern on each side. You make it as simple or as challenging as possible. And I just choose wavy lines for the bottom, which will become a pattern when I color it in. And so my peaceful activity for this square was to be in nature. So I chose hills and a sun because it reminds me of my backyard. Now, when you finish drawing the peaceful activities and borders with line and shape patterns, you're ready to outline with a black marker, Sharpie, or pen. I used an ultra fine tip Sharpie, but you can use what you have. It's fine if you just have a regular pen or a black color pencil, but I don't recommend using a crayon or an oil pastel because the details are so small, it's really hard to outline nicely. And a lot of times once we use that black, it gets mixed in with the colors that way. But a pen with ink will not do that. Another thing you want to think about is erasing. Is that after you outline your beautiful designs, you might still see your pencil lines, and that is going to interfere or get in the way of seeing your bright colors. The gray of the graphite of the pencil is really going to muddy up your colors, and you want your coloring to be as bright as you possibly can. So it's good to spend that extra time to take the time to erase those pencil lines as best as you can. Now you're ready to go ahead and color. I use twistables for mine, and I'd recommend using crayons, color pencils, or markers. Again, oil pastels are really messy for small details, so no matter what, you want to remember to use color patterns for the borders. You use line and shape patterns already, but adding that color patterns is really going to make it more like a quilt square. So 2 or more colors that repeat. Now, I started by adding the color patterns to the border, and I've shown you one as an example, but we don't need to see me color in the whole thing. And I use light green and a dark pink to start coloring in my border, and I use a different color around the edge of it. And I'm going to repeat that pattern on both sides. Again, you can do a different color pattern on every one. But you want to try and use light and bright colors and color in the paper squares completely, leaving no white spaces. You want your artwork to be noticed from a distance. That's why we make artwork, so it can be seen by people and attract them. And now I've made really bright squares, and I'm ready to move on to my fabric squares. Now, it's difficult to draw on fabric with oil pastels. For this part, I suggest drawing a simple line or shape color pattern. If you don't have oil pastels, you can try using fabric markers or regular markers if you have them. If you don't have any of those, you can just use fabric that already has a lot of patterns on it and not draw on it at all, which is totally fine. Faith Ringgold was a fabric artist, so to continue to be inspired by her work, we want to try and use similar materials. And some of us might be very good at sewing, but we still include the fabric in there as much as we can. I know I'm not really good at sewing, so this project is perfect for me and still be able to incorporate elements of Faith Ringgold's artwork. Now I'm using the oil pastels on my fabric, and my fabric is actually not very stiff, so I recommend getting some stiff fabric if you can. One place you can get fabric samples is at stores that do decorations. They have books of them that they might not be keeping, and then you won't necessarily have to cut them to the 3 by 3 inch size, or it might be easier to cut them. But I am having to hold my fabric very straight. So it's really an exercise in the strength of your hands and being able to hold the fabric as much as you can to draw on it. I'm definitely challenged. Even though I've been doing art for over 20 years, it's still a challenge for me to draw on fabric. And that's why we use the oil pastels, because it goes on the fabric and is nice, and it goes on easily as much as possible. And it still is very bright when we do it. And you can see that I started with a slanted line pattern on my first fabric square, which already had a lot of patterns and colors on it, which is perfectly fine. We're just adding more detail to that. It just adds to the wonderful rich nature of your project. And for my second fabric square, it was plain, so I had to completely add the design, and I did a repeating circle and triangle pattern with some dots in between. Now, I also like to push myself, because even though it's challenging, I wanted to make sure that I filled in all my white spaces so that, again, you can see my artwork from far away. And I added some details to my slanted stripes. I put in some straight lines on top of them. And for my last fabric square, I did something really simple, which was just straight lines repeating with 2 different colors. And that is going to do it for those patterns. You want it, for the fabric, you keep it simple. Now, once you've completed all the squares, you'll need your large painted paper. It should be dry by now. You're going to spend some time deciding how you want to arrange your squares. Once you've decided, you can glue them down. I use liquid glue and a brush to spread it on the back of the squares. You don't have to use a brush, but I think it helps to cover the square completely as possible. Also, if you do use a brush, you really want to make sure that you wash that brush as soon as you are done with it. I left some space between the squares so that eventually it can draw a pattern around them after they've been glued down. When you're done gluing the squares, you're going to lay a piece of paper over your art and get some heavy books to pile them on top. You want the piece of paper there because you have oil pastels and other colors coming through, so you don't want the oil pastels to rub off on your books. Also, you might have some glue peeking out the edges of your squares, so it'd be better to have it stuck to a regular piece of paper than on your books. And last, because you painted the paper, it might curl a little bit from the paint. So the books are going to help create a nice flat artwork. And then it should be ready for you to draw on it to make the colors and patterns. So I have my liquid glue and I have a brush. And I'm trying to decide how the squares should be arranged. This is what we call composition. And it really is up to you what you think looks best. I was having some trouble deciding what I wanted, and it was based on how the colors looked. So I really took some time to figure out how I wanted it, and even had some last minute changes. Once I figured it out, that was when I was able to get out my brush and start gluing them. So I flipped them over, and I get the brush and I go ahead and lay that glue on there. And again, I leave space in between so that I'll be able to draw a pattern on it later. Again, it's really important if you use a brush for doing the gluing process that you wash that glue off the brush. Otherwise, you're going to be ruining that brush. All the bristles are going to get very stiff and you won't be able to use that brush in the future. You might want to use something that's disposable to spread it on if you really want to, and in some cases you could just use your finger. But if you're using like regular liquid glue from the applicator, you don't have to worry about any of that at all. What you do want to worry about is making sure that it's covered as much as possible. And you can see that my fabric square is not going on there completely straight. So you might have to take some time to arrange it and straighten it out so that everything is really, nice and even as much as possible, just like a quilt. Now I'm almost ready to have everything completely done. And I will be ready, at that point I'll be able to do the last step of the project, which is making a pattern around the border. And so I put my paper on there and I lay my books on. I want to leave it for maybe a half an hour or more. The last step of the project is to create patterns around the border of your large paper. You can use oil pastels, crayons, color pencils, or markers. I used oil pastels because the colors are bold and bright. I created a different pattern on each side of the larger paper. And the last part was that I created a pattern around each individual quilt square as well. Now, as I said, I did a different pattern on every edge because I wanted it to really shine and catch people's attention, to be just like a quilt square with lots of different lines and shapes and variety. I use oil pastels because they're bright and they go on a painted surface, especially a painted paper, very easily. You might find that if you use markers, that your markers might kind of run out of ink while you're doing it because they're not used to necessarily drawing on paint. Color pencils won't necessarily be as bright, but if you use light colors when you painted it, then you should be able to still get some bright colors. And again, color pencils will have the similar effect as crayons, is that they might not be as bright. But the oil pastels, although they're messy and they might stain your hands, they definitely come out super bright and they are nice and smooth when you use them. Now you can see that I'm doing the same pattern around every edge of each individual quilt square just because I wanted to keep it a little more simple. I'm also, you might notice, sort of running out of space a little bit on the edges, and that's perfectly fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can run into each other, and you can use as many different lines or shapes as possible. I use spiral lines and zigzag lines, slanted lines, straight lines, circles. You can use diamonds, rectangles. It's your choice. And now I have pretty much completed. I'm adding the finishing touches. I always like to challenge myself and add a little bit more at the end to give it that extra wow factor. So now you have your very own mixed media peace quilt inspired by the artwork of Faith Ringgold, showing the peaceful activities that you love to do. We used a lot of different art tools and we learned about Faith Ringgold's life and her amazing artwork. I hope you enjoyed the project. Please share your artwork with me by taking a photo and sending it to missgatelyartroom@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope we'll be able to do more projects together soon.